Hello, good evening. Hello. Okay. I'm honored tonight to introduce the first part of our two-part lecture series from the Design of Theory Fellows from 2013-2014. The Design of Theory Fellowship was launched as a step toward increasing the presence of theory here at SCI-Arc, and that in part emanated from Moss, but truly was the brainchild of a group of people who are here represented tonight, in addition to Joe Day and Ming Feng, Hernan, John, Marcelin, Todd. Eventually, I think it was hoped that the Design of Theory Fellowship would develop into a degree program in theory at SCI-Arc. But it's also in itself becoming a landmark program for an academic career launchpad, and is getting copied at other schools, one of which is competing with us tonight for an audience. And I think that we could probably speculate on whether or not the Design of Theory Fellowship could replace what I think is the more troubled waters of the PhD as the wave of future architectural ideas and theoretical endeavors in architecture. And so in that case, when I say landmark, I think I'm also saying that it's embarking on a frontier that is important. We owe very much to Hernan and to Ming and John in obtaining the funding and support for the program, and Hernan for working very quickly to initiate this program. It was initiated extremely quickly. And so noting its nascency, I'm happy to use this occasion to send off one of the first of the two brave experimental victims, Stefano Passeri. Mr. Passeri came to SCI-Arc by way of a master's in the philosophy of language from King's College and a BSc in architecture from the Bartlett. And we ruined all of that with an MArch2 here at SCI-Arc, and then he begged for more. Seriously, though, he was in our minds as a perfect candidate for this fellowship, advanced enough in both theory and architecture to begin to be able to forge this new pedagogical destiny. And so beyond the sense that I think that the Design of Theory Fellowship may be positioned on this frontier of a changing landscape of architectural pedagogy and the production of architectural knowledge, beyond the fact that I think we're moving away from a kind of 19th century model of architectural matriculation, I'm also a firm believer in the design part of this fellowship. That theory for us in architecture is a still, I would call, as yet incomplete and somewhat borrowed project. And that for us in architecture, it's going to need to be not only owned by us, but in effect redesigned for us for our own goals and ambitions and speculations in the future of architecture. So Mr. Passeri came to us already qualified to speculate and change not only the theory of design, but also therefore then the design of theory. But in case his qualifications weren't enough, he won me over with the following. So this was in his letter of application. And he includes this. It's a little bit of, it's a quote, or at least it's written as a quote. And it says, "Don't sow, grow offshoots. Don't be one or multiple, be multiplicities. Run lines, never plot a point. Speed turns the point into a line. Be quick, even when standing still, exclamation. Line of chance, line of hips, line of flight. Don't bring out the general in you. Don't just have ideas, just have an idea, Godard. Have short-term ideas. Make maps, not photos or drawings. Be the pink panther and your loves will be like the wasp and the orchid, the cat and the baboon." And it's quoted from, quote, "a French guy whose name I forgot." And with that, welcome back and goodbye, Stefano Passeri.
Thank you everyone for coming. I know it's a Friday night, so there's quite a lot of people here. That's great to see all of you. And I also wanted to thank the people that actually allowed this fellowship to be possible, and actually for me to be part of it straight away after my master's. So I want to personally thank Eric, Ming, Hernan, John, and everyone else that was involved, Dora and Marcel and Todd, for their continuing support because they gave me this amazing opportunity to work on something that is really, and this is in the way I would present it, is really a seamless continuation. It's a seamless process between the work that I did during my master's and the way in which that research found a new form through the fellowship. This is kind of the approach that I'm going to have to the talk tonight. And of course, at the end, I'm going to try to show as well how this could be furthered into future work as well. So I'm just going to show you very quickly what I'm going to speak about tonight. And so first, I'm going to talk really quickly about the achievements of the fellowship, so what we did. And but I don't really want to focus on that too much. I'm going to just give an outline of that. What I really want to make the center of this talk tonight is the actual research itself. And rather than going through it, point by point or assignment by assignment, I've tried to weave a narrative between, just basically tell a story and kind of explain how some early design interests that started to outline a problem gradually became a topic for a theoretical research this year, and hopefully are going to convert again into design or God knows what in the future. Just to move on, the main accomplishments of the fellowship this year were what is just listed here. There's a journal called Offramp that I'm going to talk about in slightly more detail in a minute, because I think that specifically deserves a little bit more time. As well as that, we taught a CS seminar that, of course, was the beginning it was the first opportunity for me to start developing a topic that then I would start writing about and do further research on. And there is writing, which is the center of this fellowship, and also is kind of the centerpiece of the argument that I'm going to talk about in the main part of the lecture, and obviously this lecture tonight. As an aside, there were a few other tasks that were part of the fellowship, and I think in a very intelligent way, we were encouraged to also be assistant teachers for studio and cultural studies, in a way so as to, actually put in practice this approach in which design and theory could coexist. And an argument that was teased out from a paper could be applied or suggested to be applied to a project, etc. We also did a symposium proposal, which hasn't gone ahead yet, but is part of our output. And also, we were in charge of doing the question and answer lectures on Wednesday night. But to move on, I want to just spend a few words talking about Offramp, because I feel that's not yet been fully publicized, and it's definitely out by now. It's a website, and it's the Journal of SCI-Arc, which is not new, actually. It used to exist. Between 1987 and 2000, SCI-Arc had a journal, and there were 7 issues, and then the title was discontinued. Ben Farnsworth, who is, by the way, the other fellow, and he is going to give the other part of this talk in 2 weeks, and everyone should go. Ben Farnsworth and I were the editors of the next issue to come out since 2000, issue 8. You can see the cover there. And we really wanted to bring out the feeling of Los Angeles in this issue, and how SCI-Arc could be understood as a centerpiece in the cultural production of this kind of milieu. And we called the New Los Angelisms in a way to echo, to try and think how the place changed since the last attempts to theorize it were really put out. We were thinking about Banham and Mike Davis, and the fact that this is really outdated. And so the issue talks about the differences that you can find in Los Angeles between that time and now. There is another issue of Offramp. By the way, this is the cover of the first issue of Offramp from 1987. And these are the other 6 covers of the previous issues, quite a range of approaches, as you can see. But there is another issue coming out, which Ben Farnsworth, Ben Smith, the new theory fellow, congratulations, by the way, and myself are editing. And the topic of this issue is lies, and it's at the moment is intended to be a discussion or an update of the status of representation in architecture, and in the sense that, again, going back to what Dora was saying about the design and theory, it will address representation in terms both of its theorization and in terms of actual work. And I'm mentioning this in a little more detail because the piece of writing that I'm working on for this issue is actually going to be the main subject of this talk, and I'm going to go back to it in just a second. So from now on, and I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible, what I'd like to talk about is the way this actually became a kind of lineage for me from my work during my master's until now. And the understanding of a problem, or what I think might be a problem for architecture, that I began to work on maybe somewhat unconsciously at the beginning, but that gradually became clearer and clearer up to the point where I feel like I'm in a position now to say something about it and to maybe actively contribute to a little bit of its advancement. In what I'm going to say, I followed Marcelin's advice to try and be as to contaminate the design work and the theoretical research and the writing as much as possible. So I will present, and this process is not going to be linear. I'm going to present earlier design work after talking about aspects of it that I was just able to understand. And so it's definitely not linear, it's definitely not chronological. It's a bit like that Deleuze quote that Dora mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. It goes in several directions. There might be some non sequiturs, but I feel that it brings out this idea that retroactively informs some earlier work, and at the same time stimulates future work through the fellowship itself. And so it all started here. This is how the interest began, and this was my enemy. This was the enemy. It was a few years ago, but I don't really feel so much against it now. I don't have any feeling at all about it. But this was the enemy, and so I was looking at a lot of this stuff around me, and there was so much exterior form. There were just slick surfaces, slick facade, slick geometry and parametric subdivisions. I felt that there was too much exterior in the work that I was seeing, maybe here and in other places as well. And so at the beginning, my sense was just to want to have more interior in my work. And the way I went about it was, ironically, the way I went about it first through some of my work here, some of my experimentations here, was by trying to attack that exterior. And what I was doing was basically trying to poke fun at it, to understand ways in which I could deflect or redirect this huge importance and this kind of huge concern with elegant exteriors, and like move it towards something else. And so in these projects are all attempt to try and do that, to counter elegance in exterior form and to work on awkwardness, uncomfortable position, and ridiculous exterior form. The tricky part of this process was that I still wanted to have a method, that I still wanted to be disciplined in the design process, and because I didn't have all those parameters to follow, I had to find ways in which, specific design problems that wouldn't be the usual, surface subdivisions or texturing, but something else, and so try to become expert in, for example, how to fold this cloth on this form to just kind of hide and caricature its exterior features. And what is kind of relevant in the context of this talk, I think that in some later projects during my master's, this attitude is kind of balanced by a desire to kind of take meaning away or caricature the exterior, but add more articulation on the interior. And I don't really stand by this work so much anymore. I'm not showing it necessarily as such as the work, but I think it's relevant to see that already this kind of deviation from understanding exterior form and kind of trying to be focused on interior was one of my concerns. But the most important thing that I think this work shows at this point is that I was trying to set up an opposition between exterior and interior, that it wasn't just as two types of space. I wasn't just looking at interior and exterior as just design problems, but I was trying to weave an aesthetics from them. I think I was concerned in more than just, an interior space being comfortable or accessible. It was something different. And so this particular aspect, this idea that interior and exterior are more than a design concern or types of spaces, is what justified all the following work as well. And this is similar ideas at work. It's this idea that the interior is more articulate and it's really where the project lies, as opposed to the exterior being something blank or dismissible or awkward and uncomfortable. And it's just the idea is to take meaning out of the exterior and to kind of infuse the interior with more importance. And so it was only during the fellowship that this thing became more conceptualized, and at that point I could start thinking of it as an architectural problem. And the reason why I say it's an architectural problem is because I found a lineage of work that I think reflects that, and it recurs at different times through history. And that's what I'm going to show next. There are examples of work that talk about the problem. And so just very briefly, what I had to do at the beginning is to really construct this problem, because I didn't have anything readily available. And this is really the center of what my research has been. And so the first thing, and I had to ask the standard questions: what is that problem? Why should we look at it now? And how can we address it in architecture? So the first thing that I looked at was I wanted to make up lineages and genealogies of projects for myself to justify this interest. And so I started thinking that there are families of projects through history that, despite having very different particularities that are contingent of their historical time, have a very resonant type of diagram that is present across the board. And so if you look at these three projects, they all have an incongruous or inconsistent addition, which is this circular drum, to a composition in which it doesn't really belong. From the Pantheon, famously the Pantheon is this kind of hybrid of conflation or of a Greek temple front with a typology that at the time was inconceivable, that was never done before. And because of the way the Pantheon was meant to be looked at, you wouldn't really know that this interior existed until you were inside, or unless you looked at a section, which is what Piranesi did here. And so you can see a similar mechanism at work in the Altes Museum, where you have no notion of the dome inside from the outside, but you can understand it through architectural representation and the section. And finally, you have Stirling as well, where I think that the diagram is definitely in line with these other two. And of course, the space here is not inside, it's an outside, but by this kind of subsequent, this kind of progressive framing of form, this inner courtyard feels like can be understood as more of an interior, an enhanced interior, something that is even different from the inside of the building itself. And especially in this last example, I think this is how you can start thinking of interior as not just a space, but an aesthetic problem. It doesn't matter if physically it's not inside, but the meaning of its arrangement in the architectural composition is what's important. And so a parallel line of projects that I started from the Parthenon it has a very similar kind of idea of architectural composition, even though what's at the center is not so much this incongruous form, but it's an inaccessible interior. So you can see, for example, in the Parthenon, the cella, the place in the middle, this space here in the center, is what all the rest of the architecture frames. It's arguably the most important space is where the god lives, but you can't go into it. It's an inaccessible space. And so what's interesting to me for the kind of line that I'm trying to draw is that the most important part of a building is something you can get into, and everything else around it becomes this kind of framing apparatus to stage it. And you could argue that the modern counterpart of this problem is the Farnsworth house that has right there at the center an inaccessible utility room. There's like a little hatch at the back of the kitchen that is kind of partially hidden, but you can't really get into it. It's just where there has been this parallel where you could argue that Mies potentially looked at technology in the same way as the Greeks looked at the gods, and they put it at the center in this kind of subsequent framing of the thing. But what's even more interesting is the kitchen at the Farnsworth house doesn't at all use the incredible views that you get on the outside. When you're cooking, you're actually giving your back to the outside, and you're facing a blank wall behind which is this inaccessible space. And it really works in a similar way. The effects that are produced are virtually identical to the ones in the Parthenon. And I think you can extend this line of projects further. I find the glass house to be particularly interesting because I think it conflates these two typologies. You have this kind of inaccessible, inconsistent drum that clearly doesn't belong in the modernist grade of composition of the project. And at the same time, when you enter it from the line of sight of entry, it just looks like a blank brick wall, which obviously has a program inside, and it's the fireplace of the house. Which leads me to the last example of this line, which is the Miller house, in which, again, the fireplace, which is the centerpiece of the project, has two chimneys. And one chimney goes outside, and another chimney is capped mid-air before it reaches the ceiling, meaning that the inside-outside dichotomy is completely collapsed. There is one chimney that goes out, there's one chimney that stops. Which one is the inside and which one is the outside? And again, it feels that all the pods and all the fragmentation of form that happens at the Miller house serve to stage the presence of this object at the center, which is, taken by itself, may be negligible, but when it's seen as, it's just a fireplace, but when it's seen in the context of the way it's framed, it acquires a completely different meaning. And that, the two chimneys operate in the same way as the kitchen facing in at the Farnsworth house. They just want you to look at it that way. And so I feel that this quote, which I'm going to get to in a second, really captures the essence of the two problems I'm looking at. You've been seeing a lot of framing of basically a strange or inaccessible void at the center of an interior space, which is the most important part of the architecture of those buildings. And I feel that, if you think about that in retrospect and in connection to the Greek temple, it's pretty obvious what it means, but you can just simply replace the temple for architecture, and that kind of almost gives the definition of the problem that I was trying to work on. And so if the purpose of architecture is to provide this framing apparatus to protect this kind of introverted interior, the manner in which this space is framed, like in all the projects that I just showed, is what I would refer to as the problem of interior, is how everything else becomes this kind of effect staging procedure for that part to exist, which is often, if you took it out of context, would be completely meaningless. And so there's a couple of quotes here, because the second part of my task was to figure out why we should look at this today. And it feels to me, through a number of reading and research, that this idea of interiority, not just in architecture but in culture at large, is something that is in the air, is something of a contemporary aesthetic sensibility. And so the best account I know of that problem that is outside architecture and kind of encompasses culture at large is from Bruno Latour, and a piece called Atmosphere, which was actually intended for an installation of Olafur Eliasson that is just an image of the sun projected inside the atrium of the Tate Gallery. So this is an art project that already deals with interiority in itself very specifically. But anyway, Latour says that because of the simultaneous extension of science and the ever-increasing entanglement of human activities with things, there is no longer any outside, and he means in society, like philosophically, but only boundaries between types of interior conditions. It's definitely possible to argue that there are works from architecture that have already engaged this problem very directly, and it seems that Koolhaas's junk space is definitely a pretty adequate translation of what Latour was saying in philosophical terms for something that is more palatable to architects. And so when defining junk space, which could be regarded as synonymous with of this problem I was talking about, it says that junk space is the residue mankind left to the planet. It's what remains after modernization has run its course. Junk space seems an aberration, but it is the essence. It is the main thing, and it is always interior, so extensive that you rarely perceive its limits. And of course, Arc-Zoom's No-Stop City from 1969 is kind of a premonition of what Koolhaas is talking about. And it's a visual representation of the same sensibility, really. And all these works, the Latour quote, the Koolhaas quote, and this particular representation of that concern, all suggest that our culture and our aesthetic milieu, and by extension architecture, are no longer made of an inside as well as an outside, but of a total or exclusive interior stuff, which needs to be defined. But this is the reason why this is more pervasive than I initially thought, and it becomes the center of the research. And so how can we update this problem is going to be the center of like what I'm going to try to write for the next issue of Offramp, which, by the way, focuses on representation as a centerpiece. And so my proposal is that if you look at these projects, they're only we could think, for example, of architectural projects as addressing a critical side and a formal side. So there is a part of the project that makes a critique of something, and there is another part of a project that uses form to translate that into objects. And so this project only works at the critical level. It's just waving your finger saying that something is bad, but it's not a building. So my concern is that if we could go back to an understanding of this problem in which objects can be produced that really reflect these principles. And so the idea that I think encompasses all these concerns and tries to translate this kind of critical or conceptual understanding into a more designable problem is something that I refer to as the interior object. And it's something that I began working on during my thesis. I had like a vague idea of what this could mean, but I hadn't really been able to articulate to the level that a few months of research through the fellowship allowed. And so first I'm going to read what I intend the interior object to be, and then I'm going to show some examples of what that is through diagrams that I have done now, but which I think going to inform my thesis work. And so what I will show is like retroactive ways of thinking about that problem, and then my thesis work at the end. Just again, according to that principle whereby design and theory in this particular work are almost freely allowed to be woven together. And so what I took the interior object to mean is a form of architectural distortion in which the represented object, despite being inevitably endowed with an inside as well as an outside, displays the strongest possible inward focus. The interior object stretches the emphasis on the interior to the limit. You basically want to design an object that has no exterior to reflect these principles. And so the goal of the interior object is to preserve objecthood. in this sense, it should be enclosed and finite. So it has to be an object. It has to be enclosed and it has to be finite. So No Stop City is not that. They suggest infinity by just bleeding out of the page. So this is something else, and this is like how I'm proposing to revisit this particular problem. And so the first operations that come to mind when trying to deal with that are the dumbest, the simplest possible ones. And so, one idea to produce objects that have no exterior is to turn them inside out and kind of squish the exterior volume and sort of seal it. So you almost think that the exterior has been trapped in the formal operation. But obviously this is very dissatisfying as a beginning. But this just, Andrew sometimes says that the best way to test an idea is to try it in the dumbest possible way. So that's it. So that doesn't work. But further investigations on these same diagrams started to lead something which is slightly more interesting, because if you begin to think that there are objects that inhabit those interior corners of the kind of inside-out form, which were kind of produced and are a residue of the operation, you can start thinking of them as belonging to this kind of recess or interior space and kind of framed as staged in a way that is not dissimilar from the other projects I was showing about, for example, Stuttgart or the Farnsworth house. But the point where I came to a kind of breakthrough that for me was much more interesting is when I started to look at this project, the one on your right. So what happens here, I think, is extremely interesting and relevant to what I'm talking about. So on the left, you have the good old section of the Pantheon from Piranesi and the elevation on the top. And on the right, you have a very, I don't think it's a very well-known project, but it exists. It is Pietro Poccianti. It's Cisternone. It's just a water reservoir. But what's so striking is that it's a section that is made into a building. So it's a representation of the interior of a project that is already about interior is translated into a form, an object. So there is no exterior to that project. It's a translation of a representation into a building. And so this was the point where I started to think, and this is something that I began again looking at during my thesis, and that's what I wanted to really start informing the project with. And this is the last one. I think it's not as powerful as the previous one, but Dennis Lasdun, this is a parallel strategy. Dennis Lasdun at the Royal College of Physicians in London basically stripped all the program that would typically be inside the building. And so there's an auditorium, and there's a hall, and there's a cafe, and they're just sort of dumped outside. And so what's interesting for what I'm looking at is the exterior of the building, which you can see in the back behind the black brick auditorium. It's just an empty shell. It's kind of, again, it's not so much the literal framing that I was talking about anymore, but it's incredibly secondary. It's as secondary as possible with respect to the objects that should be contained within it, but are actually dumped outside. And so at the beginning of my thesis, these were the kind of diagrams I was looking at. And none of this was conceptualized. The diagrams were done, but none of this was conceptualized yet, except I think what it shows in black here already bears a trace of this concern with what I'm talking about, the idea that there is an object, a thing, that through moving through the scheme or representing certain aspects of a building acts as almost liberating the form from the interior-exterior dichotomy. And now I'm just going to show you the way I went about it during thesis, as purely as a design problem. And this is the last part of what I'm going to talk about. But this is exactly what I did at the time, but for me, completely revisited and infused with a totally new meaning from the type of research I did. And so the initial form of the project was the Torus. And I chose the Torus because I felt that at the time, and given all these diagrams and these reflections, was the kind of geometry that most strongly addressed the points that I was talking about. And so if you look at it, if you look at the elevation of a torus, it's just a blank exterior. It doesn't have features, it doesn't have corners, it doesn't have virtually interest. And if you cut a section through a torus, there is a surprise. There is an object that is inaccessible, but is completely unpredicted unless you cut it, unless you look at the representation of the torus, which is the section. And also it had other interesting properties. For example, you can see on the left, the idea that it had a rail onto which a profile could rotate is something that I started to use in the project itself. And so, again, for trying in the attempt of trying to achieve this kind of maximum articulation and maximum interest on the inside versus a less defined aspect on the outside, these were studies that played some kind of part. And but even though I wanted the exterior to be, let's say, blank, I needed it to preserve some kind of figuration according to the stuff I was talking about before. I just wanted it to have a degree of figuration, enough figuration for it to look uncomfortable. And almost no features, but uncomfortable looking on the outside. That was the objective. I wanted to take as much attention and importance away from the part of the project, just basically either semantically by making the form look like a caricature, or formally by not having that much there going on. And so this was the result of the exterior form, which if you see it in this kind of context, kind of works. But when I tried to translate it into a building, that's where the project fell flat. But I'll talk about that in a second. What I tried to apply later, though, was the Cisternone idea, the idea of this kind of sectional pantheon, and actually build a sectional model of the scheme as the main form. So a cut through my project would become the project itself. And in this case, the three-dimensional cut is not an orthogonal cut, but I don't think it's totally important to the point I'm trying to make right now. And so this is another view of the same model. And so yes, the last part of the project, which it's okay to say I don't think it worked at all, is when I put it on the site. So the problem is that the buildings next to it are already way better at representing the principles I'm talking about. They're so nice and blank. And so the object is too interesting, the scale is completely wrong, and it doesn't work. And so, but the intention of having a reasonably articulate program, a reasonably believable program in a form that was utterly dismissible when looked at, is something that I kind of still subscribe to. And this is just to conclude, really. I think that in light of everything I said, and in light of all the investigations that I've done, I do feel motivated to go back to the formal level of this work and to sort of tackle it again with the new meaning of the research. Admitting, and it's fine, that the other part of the project didn't work. And so just to conclude, I want to make a point about how this, and I said it throughout the lecture, how during these 3 years at SCI-Arc, the relationship of what I did during the master's and what I did through the fellowship has been kind of inextricable, especially because I had about a week between the end of my course and the beginning of this new job. And so it makes sense as well. But the important aspect, I think, is that this kind of seamless way of working at both levels with design and theory has been an incredibly valuable tool for achieving a form of knowledge which is not purely belonging. And the other thing to say is this was the inaugural year of the fellowship, and so the meaning itself of what design and theory meant had to be teased out through testing these ideas into projects. But I think that the keeping these two aspects completely intertwined in the work is what made it so interesting. And as I was saying, there is definitely an interest in continuing to develop this topic. There is a much clearer way in which these problems have now been outlined. And what at the moment, I'm not even entirely sure whether this could take the form of a full-fledged doctorate, so a fully theoretical path, another level of design work. But what is really, really important, and what I'm really, really grateful for to have been given this opportunity, is that everything seems to be at a stage where it's kind of conceptualized and ready to be taken to a new stage, I think. And this is really everything. Thank you very much.
Have a requirement that after a theory fellow speaks, then one of the faculty is forced to ask questions. We make these guys do it. We make these guys do it all year. It's like after some lectures, I really felt bad.
It
for
was
you
very
guys.
uncomfortable at the beginning. But I learned a lot.
Your work raises no question in my mind whatsoever.
I have nothing to say.
I'm obliged to ask one. Well, you were saying you didn't, I don't know if that was a question, whether this would lead to a PhD work or further design work. Oh, I had an answer. I think the latter. I don't think it would make a very good PhD topic. I think it would make a very interesting design topic. And I just want to say, I would not be so dismissive of your thesis project. I think it's quite an important project. Not either having been on the review nor knowing anything about it during thesis prep or even maybe not even in the interim reviews, I wouldn't have guessed that the things that you talked about today was what was in it. I mean, this idea of this, I wouldn't say it's exactly about a figuration. It's about something that was oddly not figural and not figural, and it was this strange line in between that I thought was one of a handful of projects that year that I labeled the revenge of the curve, this whole other kind of potential of curves that I saw. But what I wanted to just point out was in your discussion of the interior, I think you're talking about a number of different strategies, and I think they're all interesting. I don't think they relate necessarily to one another, which is to say, because it seems like I've just been going through trying to figure out how do you identify the difference between an interior and exterior. And I gave a working list, and one of them is form itself, and you tend to have concave corners on the exterior and convex corners on the exterior and concave on the interior, and turning something in and out, inside out can do that. The other one would be figuration, because there's certain things you think of as exterior on a figure versus the interior. Say the inside face of the Statue of Liberty, if you've ever been in there, it's quite freaky. You're not used to seeing, it's something you expect to be in the outside. There's a whole other range, which is you identify the interior based on, interior decoration. I mean, there's a kind of protocol and a long history of things that belong, the propriety of it is to belong on the interior, and when that's on an exterior condition, or vice versa, that's very strange. It seems like there's certain ownership issues, and then there's climate issues, that there's an interior and exterior. And so I think there's both ways of reinforcing one, inverting them, or making weird slides between one another. And so my only suggestion would be that the diagrams that you touched on, there's probably a more exhaustive inventory of both initial conditions as well as tactics for inverting them.
And it would be great to look at them as well. Of course, yes. Yeah.
But to me, that sounds like fundamental work, architect work, rather than this whole thing. Yeah, it seems like architect work rather than theory work.
Yeah,
which is a compliment.
But it's I guess most of the year has been spent reading stuff and looking at theoretical work, and I mean it's interesting that I always find the relationship between a work and what I or anybody else says about it interesting, because you could say like I don't see any of what you're talking about in this stuff, and that happens to me several times when I look at somebody else's work and I see so that kind of begs the question of what the place of theory is in all this. It's I don't know if it's a subjective pursuit that just becomes about what I see into it, and if that can potentially reach somebody else's reading, or if it's by establishing that certain criteria here and other are not.
We'll open up. I mean, to my mind, and this is what's been so interesting about having Jeff around, is that he's one of a small handful of people that really see theory as being fundamentally to be of service to architects, as opposed to something that you could suck from architecture to turn into a field in and of itself. And I think here that seems like that would be the natural role for it. So.
Anyone else?
So that was good. I think there are a lot of lines along which it could develop. I want to offer just a couple of, I think, clarifications, because there's some slippages in the argument that you made. That
There's
I think,
definitely some non-sequiturs.
No, I'm not being accusatory at all. But I want you to sort of notice them and find ways to make them productive. And so, I mean, there were a couple of missing footnotes at the beginning and things like that, which you could layer in. But I think the more important point is that you begin talking about the kind of inaccessible interior, and then you slide into the kind of, there's the Latour bit about there is no outside, and then there is the kind of surprising inside, right? So, and you don't seem to make as much as I think you could out of those distinctions, right? That there is no inside is kind of where you begin. And
There's
then,
no outside.
Huh?
There's no outside. Oh, I see what you're saying.
But your reading of the Farnsworth house and all that other stuff sounds awfully familiar. Nonetheless, implies this kind of there is no inside condition, or there is no accessibility to the inside condition. And I think the Jeff's reading of the chimneys at the Miller house is a similar version of that. But that doesn't seem to be part of your project. And what I see in your presentation are several other projects that you could develop the kind of there is no inside as a response to Latour. The funny thing about the footnotes that you do offer, you kind of take them at face value, right? So when Latour says there is no outside, you're like, nah, okay. And if we think of someone like Sylvia, who pretty aggressively goes against that stance in Kissing Architecture, she says, if Latour is right, we're in big trouble and we need to insist on differences, which your work does seem to be doing. And so I think it would help your position to be much more pointed in your position vis-a-vis some of these other invocations that you're making. But all that is that there are a lot of different directions that I think you can take it. But I think that's the big one, is that those main categories that you outline. It seems like you could kind of develop entire projects out of the inaccessible inside, the unescapable inside. The categories that you start to lay out in the diagram. I think maybe you gave up on the diagrams a little too soon, and those could start to sponsor
Definitely.
lots more.
So
stuff.
I wonder, do you think that could be done because there's a point where you're suggesting that maybe more references, for example, including Sylvia in the discussion, might help, because it's definitely like what I guess the bottom line of this attempt is to outline something like an aesthetic sensibility and kind of propose a couple of ways in which you could tackle it.
I'd say if you're writing a paper, yes.
Okay,
if you're doing the projects, it's less.
But narrow it down, of course,
This is probably more a comment than a question, and I think I'm trying to tackle on, it's not specifically what you're talking about, but the larger context of the conversation in relation to what Andrew and Todd mentioned in terms of design theory, PhD, and so on. And I think part where I think your lecture, your talk is useful is to start to think how we can unravel a different logic how to deal with this. I mean, like, I don't know how many of you guys were here last summer when Emmanuel Petit did a lecture to present his book that he was working. And at the very end of the lecture, he says, the reason I'm interested in architecture, because architecture has a discourse unlike cinema, product design, or fashion. Which, to an extent, he's right, but I will disagree with the sense of what some of those disciplines has is there is no detachment between the production of the thing and the construction of the discourse of the thing. Like if you really talk with serious filmmakers, I'm not talking about just popcorn filmmakers, but serious filmmakers, there's not such thing as a separation. And in a way, us as a field, we feel very comfortable doing those distinctions. It's almost like it's each side of the game, try to avoid the responsibility of the other part. And to me, what is interesting is there is a certain level of confusion in your argument between those two things. Like everybody seems to say it can go one way or another. If there is anything, to me, that's a good sign in terms of what you're trying to work on it. Because I really think moving on, it should not be so easy to distinguish. And I don't think we should be so comfortable to say, oh, we have this course or not, and so on. And don't get me wrong, I think our field, our discipline is more interesting than the other one for other reasons, but not necessarily because we have the formalization of this course as a separate entity from the production of the thing. And to me, at least that's my personal obsession with the whole conversation about the fellowship and so on, is to see if you and Ben, new Ben, can help us to unravel if there is different options, how to start to think about that. In the context of an institution like ours, that certainly we're not going to have a PhD program anytime soon. So, but that doesn't mean that we, and I really think, I'm always been puzzled by this comfort that we have as a discipline to be like, to go too fast, to admit that, okay, it's very clear in our field that, oh, we have this course, we have this, we have that. And to me, the confused part of your argument seems to me the most interesting to try to figure it out.
So, by just to clarify, by confused you mean when I talk about design and theory interacting in the work?
I don't think you're confused. I'm just saying that there is an outcoming of the work that is somebody can say, yeah, you can write a paper, you can do a project. Like that is even a rational possible answer. It seems to me insane that you have that option. You know what I mean? So I just think we should feel less comfortable about that possibility.
For instance, when I was driving up here this morning, David Fincher was on talking about
Do you have a microphone?
And he was being quite theoretical.
Was he?
And it was absolutely about how he conceptualized the film, which was an adaptation from the novel. And so there was a lot of discussion about how the screenplay had to change in order to, the novel had to turn into a screenplay and had to change the way it operated fundamentally. And Fincher's discussion of that, you should find the podcast. I mean, it was really, I think, brilliant. In like a couple of minutes, the way that his conceptualization of the film affected his reading of the screenplay and his reading of the novel, I think is the kind of thing that you're talking about,
Well,
that you can't have one without the other.
Fincher is a great example in the sense this is her third movie in a row. They tackle the problem of novels. The Social Network, go with Dracula 2 and this one, right? And his obsession part of the thing is, for example, I remember in the Social Network, and I know this firsthand because I saw it in the editing room. He had a whole sequence, the Robin sequence in England. It doesn't really exist in the book.
Right.
And the only reason he did it is because Franz Reznor musical score was set up for that. Yeah. And he wanted to figure it out how to build that into the narrative.
Yeah, and
so there was a whole kind of a cinematic construction of the things that didn't exist, neither in the novel, neither in the script. And
right.
It became, so I think you're right on the
No,
line.
it's a very similar thing happened in this new film where the novel, it lives in the head of one of the characters for the most part. And so when Fincher was talking to the novel, it's like, well, we have to turn that into like affectations that you can see on the screen. And so when you start discussing the nature of interior features and the kind of affectlessness of the figure and all of the, like, I think those are the architecturalization. That's the architectural analog of that kind of serious conceptual work that needs to be done to do design, right? And
yes.
So it's not that I can theorize it after the fact or that I, but that it actually has to be part of the process. And I do think that's where your work is best, and you should.
But it seems that what now that you've talked about it, seems that there is this kind of, there's definitely in what I've shown there is probably more than two trajectories, but there's definitely two trajectories, one of which is a conceptual thing and the other one is a design thing, and they don't really coincide at all yet, but there is some kind of common thread that maybe like hidden the spot where the two can kind of influence each other in the most productive way. No?
No, that answer makes me think you need another year. In fact, they're not separate. They're not separate.
Yeah, but I think it takes work to make them work together well. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, that was the idea. Okay. Thank you very much for coming.